Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents American Zealots, Inside Right-Wing Domestic Terrorism by Arie Perliger. Narrated by Timothy Andrés Pabon. Publisher's note: this audiobook refers to figures and tables included in the print and ebook editions of the book. 1. The challenges of comprehending and responding to domestic terrorism. Why study the violent far right? In the morning hours of August 5th, 2012, the Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin was crowded, filled mostly with children and young mothers engaged in preparations for the langar, a traditional Sikh communal meal that was to be held later that day. Paramjit Kaur was one of them. While her kids were already grown, her youngest was 18 years old, she did not want to miss the opportunity to join her community and help in the preparations. Around 10 a.m., while Paramjit was praying with her sister inside the temple, they both suddenly heard gunshots. Paramjit and her sister stood, hoping to find a safe place to hide, and a bullet hit Paramjit in the back, inflicting fatal injuries. The shooter was Wade Michael Page, a 40-year-old man from the nearby town of Cudahy, Wisconsin, who upon his arrival at the temple started firing at its inhabitants using his Springfield XDM 9mm automatic pistol, which he had purchased several days earlier. During his shooting spree, he killed Paramjit and 5 male worshippers. When around 10:25 a.m. the first police officers arrived and engaged with Wade, he was able to return fire and injure one of them before being shot in the stomach. He then aimed his pistol at his head and committed suicide. The subsequent investigation by law enforcement linked Page to various far-right associations, mainly from the skinhead subculture and the white power music scene. His first significant exposure to the white supremacy movement occurred in 1995 at Fort Bragg, the home of the 82nd Airborne Division and the U.S. Army's Special Forces Command. In the mid-1990s, it was also a hub for neo-Nazis who were engaged in recruitment efforts for the National Alliance, the most prominent American neo-Nazi organization of the 1980s and 1990s. When 3 paratroopers from Fort Bragg killed a black couple in Fayetteville in 1995, the Army initiated an investigation of far-right associations at the military base, and Page was one of 19 paratroopers discharged for participating in hate activities. Since the end of his military career, Page increased his involvement in hate activities, primarily as part of various skinhead associations, where he was able to combine his love of music with the promotion of white supremacy. Page's life story reflects that he was not a conventional lone wolf, but a representative of a broad and influential subculture that spans various facets of American society. Just a few weeks after the attack in Oak Creek, in an unrelated incident, law enforcement discovered that several soldiers from Fort Stewart, a military base in Georgia, were part of a militia that had been involved in the killing of at least 2 people and was actively stockpiling weapons and explosives to give the government back to the people. It was later determined that the militia also comprised non-military members who, among other things, were plotting to assassinate President Barack Obama. During the final days of summer 2012, I was closely following these events. Beyond my long-term professional interest in political violence, I was in the final stages of a 2-year study that sought to decipher the current landscape of far-right violence in the United States. Whereas most of the information on these events was made public at an infuriatingly slow pace, as is usually the case when law enforcement agencies are reluctant to release information before the completion of a criminal investigation, media outlets and policymakers wasted no time in warning us about another wave of far-right violence, expressing various opinions and ideas regarding the root causes and nature of this phenomenon. Many such discussions also reflected and promulgated common misconceptions and fallacies that dominate the popular discourse about the American violent far right. such as an inability to distinguish among its various components, a lack of understanding of its ideological tenets, and the tendency to ignore that the violent far right had always been present in American society. If anything, the level of far-right violence had been rising steadily for the last 2 decades. I never stopped studying the American far right, and it was clear to me that the dynamics visible during and after the 2016 elections necessitated a new effort in order to understand the dramatic rise in far-right violence, as well as its new characteristics, the rise of what I term spontaneous violence, the further decentralization of far-right groups, and the growing tendency to focus on attacks against religious targets. Moreover, more terrorist attacks, such as the attack on the worshippers at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue on October 27, 2018, in which 11 people were killed and another 6 injured, and the attack on an El Paso Walmart on August 3, 2019, which led to the death of 22 shoppers, were perpetrated by individuals who were radicalized and exposed to white supremacy narratives online. Events such as these emphasize the growing importance of studying far-right online communities and the specific mechanisms by which they inspire militant activism. Finally, the surprising tendency of some militant far-right associations, such as some skinhead groups, to denounce the use of violence points to the fact that we need an in-depth exploration of how the penetration of far-right concepts and practices into formal, mainstream political processes affects the nature and causes of contemporary far-right violence. This book aims to illustrate, analyze, and explain the recent developments in American far-right violence, while also providing a broad historical and geographical context. Several major insights drive this approach. To begin with, like many other social and political movements, the American far right is influenced by and cooperates with foreign actors. Close relationships have evolved between American neo-Nazi and skinhead groups, and similar groups in European and other Anglo-Saxon countries, such as Australia and Canada, and some U.S. white supremacy groups also provide active support to foreign nationalist militias. For example, far-right activists from U.S. organizations such as the Atomwaffen Division and Rise Above movement joined ultranationalist militias operating in eastern Ukraine. Moreover, some components of the American far right originated in other countries. The Christian identity movement, one of the popular streams within the American far right, is a descendant of an ideological movement that emerged in 19th century Britain. Similarly, the American skinhead subculture was initially imported from Europe and in turn was exported to other Anglo-Saxon countries. Thus, the examination of historical and geographical vectors is necessary in order to decipher the various dynamics that affect the nature of the American far right. Second, even when focusing on the United States, it is clear that different elements of the American far right prospered in specific regions and communities in different historical periods, which further emphasizes the importance of geographical and historical context in the exploration of the American far right. This book also aims to bridge some specific gaps in our understanding of contemporary far-right violence. An overview of the existing literature on the American far right shows a relatively high number of historical studies on specific groups, movements, and events. Less common are comprehensive and comparative studies that use the tools of the quickly expanding literature on political violence and extremism. Moreover, the relatively small number of texts that have tried to provide a panoramic analysis of the American far right are becoming dated or lack empirical data about the magnitude of the phenomenon and trends within it. I strive to fill this gap by using high-resolution data to produce a comprehensive ideological, operational, and organizational analysis of the various streams of the violent American far right. and by developing a multifaceted explanatory framework based on elements from social movements, far-right politics, and political violence literature. Finally, whereas the existing literature tends to focus on the actors, whether organizations or individuals, and traditionally puts less emphasis on analyzing trends in the characteristics of the violence, this book devotes significant efforts to identifying relations between the operational universe and the ideological and organizational ones. In other words, how is violence shaped by the changing environment and characteristics of the various far-right groups? Far-right violence, a threat to the American ethos? On June 4, 2019, the FBI's Assistant Director provided a statement to the House of Representatives Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, part of the Oversight and Reform Committee, regarding the need to confront white supremacy. In that statement, he emphasized the rise in hate crimes and related acts of violence, as well as the impact of such incidents on communities. 6 weeks later, Christopher Wray, the FBI's director, stated, "I will say that a majority of the domestic terrorism cases that we've investigated are motivated by some version of what you might call white supremacist violence, but it does include other things as well." These statements are an indication that American law enforcement acknowledges the need to address the rise in the level of violence from the far right of the political spectrum. Nonetheless, in other parts of those statements, it was made clear that the FBI does not necessarily see this threat as any different from other types of terrorism. The director of the FBI stressed that, "We, the FBI, don't investigate the ideology, no matter how repugnant. We investigate violence, and any extremist ideology, when it turns to violence, we're all over it." The question of whether the response of the criminal justice system to domestic terrorism needs to be different from its response to foreign terrorism is not the focus of this book. But it is important nonetheless to understand the unique challenges that domestic acts of terrorism represent to the social and political fabric of the American Republic. Most foreign terrorism seeks to shape American policy abroad, but domestic far-right terrorism is aiming to change American political constructs and societal norms and practices fundamentally. Thus, domestic far-right terrorism does not just represent a more close and immediate physical threat for most Americans, but also affects their immediate social and political environment and behavior. More important, the majority of foreign terrorism is perpetrated by non-Americans and in most cases takes place outside the continental United States. It is perceived as part of a global ideological struggle rather than something necessarily a product of American politics or society. Far-right terrorism, as will be established in Chapter 3, was always part of the American political landscape, and thus its intensity was always an indicator of the country's stability and health of its democratic and liberal practices. Therefore, understanding the factors that lead to a rise in support for far-right ideology and violence is crucial for ensuring that American society maintains its liberal, democratic, and inclusive ethos and can address groups that aim to undermine those virtues. Far-right terrorism also represents a substantial threat in terms of its ability to shape political discourse and related civilian norms. The effectiveness of terrorism is not determined only by its direct impact, casualties, and damage to property, but also by how effective the violence is in instilling doubts in the minds of people regarding the legitimacy or utility of existing political values, norms, and practices. And while it seems reasonable to assume that foreign terrorism's ideological frameworks will have limited appeal to most Americans, domestic terrorism, which focuses on domestic policies and value-based issues at the center of the political debate in the United States, represents a more substantial threat in terms of its ability to mobilize popular support for militant practices. In this context, it is important to emphasize the relatively positive connotation that violent civilian resistance has in the American popular historical mindset, as such groups were crucial in the struggle for American independence, as well as in some of the subsequent conflicts in which the United States was involved. Thus, violently confronting and challenging a central rule is not automatically perceived as illegitimate, as it is in many other democracies. The threat from domestic terrorism is also more acute as a result of the increasing political polarization within American society since the late 1990s. As the book will depict in chapters 4, 5, and 6, this polarization intensifies some core factors that are responsible for the rise in far-right violence. The growing popularity of the view that competition in the American political system is a zero-sum game with limited space for political compromise leads to extreme interpretations of the political reality, which in turn can inspire violent political activism. Moreover, since this polarization emphasizes the need to maximize any political victory or to avoid by all means political defeat, extremists will be inclined to use violence to further push their preferred policies or to take advantage of what they perceive as a tolerant political environment in the case of a victory for their political camp. The overlap between political and ethnic divisions in the United States further facilitates a rise in domestic political violence. The accumulating evidence that minorities and immigrants are more inclined to support left-wing policies intensifies interethnic and interracial tensions that lend themselves to the popularization of extreme far-right views, which are more permissive toward violence against minorities. As the analysis in Chapter 5 confirms, there is a direct correlation between the increase in the population's diversity and the rise in far-right violence. And since most demographic predictions forecast an even more diverse U.S. population, identifying mechanisms that can counter such tendencies is a crucial step if Americans want to curb the rise in far-right violence. Finally, as political polarization intensifies, political leaders naturally tend to move to the extreme of the ideological spectrum, where they believe most voters are located, and in the process absorb and disseminate provocative and more extreme ideological narratives that will help them solidify their new ideological image. Indeed, Chapter 7, which explores the new discourse of the American far right, illustrates the growing overlap between far-right ideological narratives and those of what is considered the mainstream right. Tropes of conspiracy theories that in the past were the sole domain of the far right appear today in expressions of many mainstream right-wing ideological platforms and leaders, and at the same time far-right groups, seeking to appeal to larger audiences, are not hesitant to promote policies that are the bread and butter of the American right, such as positions on gun legislation and environmental policies. Organization of the book. The dynamic nature of the far right in the United States, and its multitude of ideological and operational facets, can be perplexing to many students of this ideological sphere. Hence, the first part of the book will strive to provide some clarity about the historical origins of the different streams of the violent American far right, as well as their unique ideological and operational characteristics. Specifically, Chapter 2 will introduce listeners to the main concepts and theories used to describe and explain far-right politics and violence, and how they can be beneficial for studying the American case. Additionally, I discuss the main ideological pillars of the American far right and their intellectual origins. Chapter 3 discusses the history of the various ideological streams of the American far right and how their organizational and operational facets evolved over time. The second section of the book focuses on an empirical examination of contemporary violent manifestations of the American far right and attempts to illuminate the social, economic, and political facilitators of far-right violence, and how, in turn, these also influence American political and social dynamics. Chapter 4 presents the comprehensive dataset of far-right violence constructed for this book and discusses the various tactics and forms of violence that are utilized by far-right groups, how they have changed over time, and how tactical choices of the groups are in many cases reflections of their ideological inclinations. Chapter 5 uses the dataset and other sources to test various theories for explaining trends in the level of far-right violence in the United States. Additionally, it discusses the main facilitators of the recent rise in far-right violence, while also exploring how the characteristics of various geographical areas and demographic changes play a role in this process. Chapter 6 tries to identify the potential demographic and psychological profile of the perpetrators of far-right violence and examines the fundamental difference between spontaneous and calculated perpetrators. The last section of the book provides a window to the contemporary dynamics and rhetoric of the American far right. Chapter 7 uses a broad range of primary sources to examine the goals, rhetoric, propaganda, ideological discourse, and future plans of American far-right groups, and explain how these may shape the future evolution of this ideological sphere. Chapter 8 summarizes the main findings of the book and provides a broader overview of their implications, both in terms of the challenges the United States is facing in ensuring the stability and competency of its political system and the security of its citizens. It also offers a theoretical and analytical perspective to provide some insights about the path forward for those interested in further studying the American violent far right. 2. An ideological typology of the violent far right. The Jewish Community Center of Greater Kansas City is located in Overland Park, an upscale and mostly peaceful suburb of Kansas City, Missouri. On most days, the center's facilities holds various activities and celebrations of the local Jewish community. The center also hosts an array of non-denominational cultural events. In the early afternoon hours of April 13, 2014, the center was crowded with teenagers who had arrived to audition for KC Superstar, a singing competition, and by actors and crew members of a local theater group who were preparing for a 2 p.m. performance of To Kill a Mockingbird. Around 1 p.m., sounds of gunfire reverberated in the center's parking lot. A gunman tried to shoot at 2 bystanders who luckily were able to escape before getting injured, one by foot and the other in his car. Subsequently, the shooter shifted his attention to a car parking nearby, driven by Dr. William Corporan, who was bringing his 14-year-old grandson, Reet Griffin Underwood, to audition for the KC Superstar competition. Dr. Corporan was shot in the head and died shortly afterward. His grandson was also wounded and was rushed to a local hospital, where he died a few hours later. After shooting several rounds at the center's building and the horrified crowd, the gunman returned to his car and drove to the parking lot of the Jewish retirement community of Village Shalom, located less than a mile from the Jewish Community Center. He resumed his attack by shooting at several people who were in the parking lot, killing Terry Lamano, an occupational therapist who had just arrived for her weekly visit with her mother. The massive manhunt by local police relied on a description of the gunman's car which had been provided by witnesses. By 3 p.m. that day, 2 police officers identified the shooter's car near a local elementary school and were able to detain the gunman without him causing additional harm. The name of the gunman was Frazier Glenn Miller, Jr., a 74-year-old resident of Aurora, Missouri, and a figure familiar to law enforcement, given the various leadership roles that he had assumed within the white supremacy movement in North Carolina and Missouri for more than 30 years. The recent history of the violent American far right is exemplified by Miller's life story, which illustrates some of its dominant characteristics, its organizational heterogeneity, and its tendency for operational and ideological fragmentation. Miller joined the military in the late 1950s and retired in 1979 as a master sergeant. During those years, the U.S. military struggled tremendously to control the presence and proliferation of white supremacist views and activities within its ranks. Thus, it is not surprising that Miller was forced to retire after it was exposed that he was distributing racist texts and publications. Upon retirement, he joined a neo-Nazi group, the National Socialist Party of America, which was mainly known for its involvement in the 1979 Greensboro massacre, where marchers from the Communist Workers' Party were attacked and killed by neo-Nazi activists in Greensboro, North Carolina. While there are no indications that Miller was involved directly in the execution or planning of the Greensboro massacre, he did receive death threats in the following months from some left-wing activists. This clearly didn't deter him from deepening his involvement in the white supremacy movement. In the late 1980s, he established the Carolina Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Even though the name of the group associated it with the traditional KKK, Miller preferred to adopt practices that characterized two other segments of the American far right. First, he promoted the group's embrace of military practices and activities, styling them on the American Nazi Party's parades and ceremonies. Moreover, in a fashion that usually characterizes American neo-Nazi groups, he preferred that his followers wear uniforms rather than the KKK's traditional white robes. Second, as with many of the militia groups of that time, he aspired to engage in military training so the organization could eventually establish a free territory. Specifically, he aspired to establish a Carolina Free State in areas of North and South Carolina. In these ways, his organization reflected the growing ideological and operational overlap between the traditional KKK, neo-Nazi groups, and militia movement. By the mid-1980s, Miller had changed the name of his organization to the White Patriot Party, emulating similar initiatives by other leaders of the far right, such as Thomas Metzger and David Duke, who were trying to shape a cleaner and more sophisticated image for the white supremacy movement by adopting a civil rights rhetoric focused on what they perceived as a violation of the rights of white people. Miller followed suit and declared that his party would aim to achieve the unification of white people and would act peacefully unless the federal government infringed on the rights of white people. But Miller didn't wait. And between 1986 and 1987, he faced a series of investigations related to his militant activities, which included the stockpiling of military weapons and technology, such as hand grenades, C4 explosives, and automatic guns, organizing military training drills for his supporters, and promoting actual attacks. For example, in a letter to his supporters that was tracked by the FBI in 1987, Miller ordered his followers to kill our enemies and introduced a point system for different targets. African Americans counted for 1 point. White race traders and Jews counted for 10 points. Judges for 50 points. And Morris Seligman Dees, a known civil rights activist and one of the founders of the Southern Poverty Law Center, for 888 points. In 1987, Miller pleaded guilty to illegal use of weapons and mailing of a threat and received a 5-year prison sentence. He was released after 3 years. After his release from prison, Miller shifted his focus, again, like many of his generation's leaders, to online propaganda. And while he was never as well known as Thomas Metzger, the founder of Stormfront, the most popular far-right website, he was still able to draw traffic to his website and his commentaries. Eventually, in 2014, Miller returned to his violent practices. When he was caught after his shooting spree, he left no doubt about his motives, shouting, "Heil Hitler," and asking the arresting officers, How many fucking Jews did I kill? The answer is 0. None of Miller's victims on April 13th was Jewish.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?